Hello and welcome to the ultimate guide on Macbeth, teaching you the stuff to get grade 9, the stuff you won't be learning in school. We are on Act 2, Scene 3, and in this scene, I think Shakespeare is asking us, is Macbeth having a laugh? Now, you've probably not been taught the scene this way. So the normal interpretation is that Lennox's words, "The night has been unruly, where we lay our chimneys were blown down, and as they say, lamentings heard in the air," and all sort of these hints that something awful has happened, that's so terrible it's affected nature. All these hints are about the great chain of being. In case you don't know about this, the idea is that God is at the top, then you have the angels, and then you have the royals appointed by God. Beneath them you have lords and different degrees of human beings, so that peasants would come at the bottom of this pyramid of importance, or this chain that links everyone together. So the view was, if you attacked God's appointed king or queen, you were really attacking God. The idea being that by assassinating Duncan, Macbeth has upset God's natural state of nature, and this is why the earth was fervorous and did shake. It's an earthquake, timed to coincide with the killing of Duncan. But look at Lennox, he says, "some say," which means he's calling into question the idea of the great chain of being. And I absolutely love Macbeth's reply, where he says, yeah, it was a rough night, all right, wasn't it? I mean, he's just murdered the king. And when he'd killed Duncan, the great Neptune's oceans were never going to wash his hands clean. He heard voices saying, "Macbeth will sleep no more. Macbeth has murdered sleep." He told Lady Macbeth, "'Twere know my deed, 'twere best not know myself. Oh, melodrama, drama." And now here he is just a few hours later saying, "Yeah, it's a pretty bad night, wasn't it, mate?" Like, completely underplaying what he's done. It's as though he is using dramatic irony here to have a laugh at his own evil act. Of course, it was an incredibly rough night for Duncan, who he'd murdered, and he's now amused by this. So we can definitely see that the killing has changed Macbeth's personality. The Macbeth who ended the previous scene is totally different from this new Macbeth who has been transformed by murdering Duncan. Now, you might say this is a play warning people not to kill the king, not to commit regicide. Why would Shakespeare risk putting comedy in it? Well, actually, that is one of the characteristics of tragedy. So tragedies come to us from the ancient Greeks, and they had this idea of catharsis. So once you get a really tragic event, like the killing of Duncan, you follow it up with instances of comedy. And really the only scene that's played for laughs in this play is with the porter, and it immediately follows the killing. Now Shakespeare is mixing the two. Macbeth is playing with the idea of tragedy and the comedy that brings catharsis. It's that kind of dark humour that helps you cope with terrible events. Now Shakespeare has a little bit more comedy up his sleeve. So Macduff, when he hears about the killing of Duncan, reacts in a very, very odd way. "Confusion now hath made his masterpiece. Most sacrilegious murder hath broke out the Lord's anointed temple, and stole thence the life of the building." He doesn't even mention Duncan's name or the king. This feels totally artificial, and I'm going to break it down for you as a series of personifications, and it feels like a prepared game, which I'm comparing to the idea of how many people you can squash into a mini. This is not a natural thing to do, and neither is Macduff's speech. So he imagines confusion as a person who is also an artist and has prepared a masterpiece. Well, that is confusing, isn't it? It suggests that the killing of Duncan has been a really good thing. It is a masterpiece. So he's probably thinking to himself, do you know what, we're better off without Duncan. He was a pretty rubbish king. After all, he nearly lost the kingdom, didn't he? His next personification is to create a being, a human being called Murder, who is sacrilegious, going against God. But Murder is doing something. He has broken open the Lord's temple. Well, here the Lord's temple is Duncan. That language deliberately reminds us of the great chain of being, suggesting that God has appointed the king and therefore the king is the Lord's temple. Breaking open the temple is an attack on God. And what has murder done? Well, then murder has then taken away the life of the building. So now the temple is no longer a symbol of God. It's very much man-made. It's simply a building. So when Macduff moves from describing Duncan as like a temple to only a building, he's coming back to this original idea that maybe he wasn't such a good king after all. And that's another reason perhaps why he doesn't even mention Duncan's name here. So the overall effect is bizarre, and the audience in Shakespeare's day would also have found it super weird. And I'll prove it to you. Look at Lennox's reply. Mean you, His Majesty? In other words, Lennox is saying, what the hell are you talking about, Macduff? You make no sense. Which is another way that Shakespeare is playing this scene partly for laughs. And Macbeth, of course, gives Lennox that idea. He says to Macduff, what is it you say? The life? Like, what are you talking about, man? Pull yourself together. Stop being such a pussy. Again, it's a scene being played for laughs by Macbeth. Even when Macbeth and Lennox call him out for talking gibberish, Macduff still can't tell them what he's seen. He sends them in to go and have a look, speaking again through metaphor. So we're left with two choices here. Does Macduff's use of metaphor show that the act of killing the king is so horrible he can't actually find proper language to describe it? He has to use poetic language to try and get to the truth of the matter, that this is an attack on God. Well, yes, you can certainly argue that in your essays. Alternatively, however, you can see these personifications layered on top of each other as proof that this is a sort of prepared speech, as though it's something Macduff has already rehearsed, as though at the back of his mind he was always hoping someone would get rid of Duncan. If you'd like to explore this idea further, I am going to make a further video on this brilliant short story by James Thurber, you can find it, in which he treats the murder of Duncan as a whodunit, and eventually asks whether it was Lady Macbeth's father who's actually killed Duncan. Anyway, James Thurber points out that this speech from Macduff is so ridiculous that it sounds like he's covering up, and therefore he is the number one suspect for killing Duncan. Remember, he hasn't actually done that, this is just a bit of fun. Back to the play. Lady Macbeth's reaction is now also potentially played for laughs. She hears that the king has been killed, and she says, "Whoa! Alas! What? In our house?" And Banquo replies, "Too cruel anywhere," so he immediately picks up on the weirdness of her not being upset that the king is dead, but that it's happened in her house. It's basically like she's saying, well, that's a bit inconvenient, isn't it? I can't believe he's done it here. Now, we now have whole genres connected to this, so this is the cast of Desperate Housewives, which also treats killing as a comedy, as well as one which has tragic consequences. Now, the conventional view is that Lady Macbeth is panicked here into saying this, and she doesn't mean it humorously at all. She's unwittingly giving herself away as having no care that the king is actually dead, because obviously she's delighted that he's actually dead, and Banquo has picked up on this and is immediately suspicious of her. But another way of looking at it is that she actually doesn't care. She's basically daring them to pin it on her. What, it happened in our house? There's no way we were involved. It's also a really interesting way for Lady Macbeth to test out Banquo's loyalty. Instead of rushing off to see the dead king, or saying anything to Macbeth, he turns to Macduff, and look at what he calls him, Dear Duff. This is the moment that seals Banquo's fate. He's making an alliance through the language he uses to Macduff in direct opposition to the Macbeths. Now, this is important to a Shakespearean audience, especially because the play was performed at the court of King James. So a political purpose of the play is to tell those nobles that committing regicide and killing a king they might not like, King James, will lead to all kinds of tragedy. Shakespeare is also pointing out the historical link between King James and the real Banquo, and therefore he wants to portray Banquo as an essentially noble and good man, siding not with the Macbeths, as he did in real life, but with Macduff, who is eventually going to kill the tyrannical Macbeth. So in Shakespeare's time, Banquo was believed to have murdered Duncan with Macbeth. They were in partnership together. Well, of course, he doesn't want to put that in a play, which is celebrating King James. Oh, King James, by the way, you're related to a murderer who put the wrong man, Macbeth, on the throne, because that message would then question James's right to be on the throne, which is a thought that's occurring to lots of English nobles who didn't want this Scotsman becoming King of England. Then we have Macbeth's bizarre timing. There are two really interesting things here. One, when he kills the grooms, and two, when he chooses to let everybody know about it. So look at what's happened here. Macbeth and Lennox and Ross have gone off to see the dead Duncan, to get proof that he's actually dead. Macbeth then goes into this speech about how wonderful Duncan was and what a terrible tragedy it is that he's been killed. And then Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, come in, and Macbeth tells them that Duncan has been killed. But just like Macduff earlier, he does it in metaphor. You are and do not know it, the spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped. Well, that metaphor, of course, is Duncan. He too won't tell them that Duncan is dead. And that's what I mean about insincerity. We know Macbeth's speech is insincere because he's thrilled that Duncan's dead. And the fact that he's using the same literary technique, the extended metaphor, as Macduff used, strongly suggests that Macduff was also being insincere. So then Macduff finally comes out with it and says, yeah, okay, let's quit with the metaphors. It's actually your father's been killed. And then Malcolm is a little bit like Lady Macbeth. You'd expect him to be shocked that his father's been killed, but he goes, oh, right, yeah, but who did it? This isn't the wrong question to ask, but it just feels a bit odd. As though, well, I'll be happy if so-and-so had done it, but I'll be really furious if so-and-so had done it. It kind of suggests that one killer would be better than another. And of course, the other thing it suggests is that he's not really that bothered that his father's dead. Why? Because his father has just named him next in line, so obviously he's thinking, well, looks like I get to become king. It's not too bad a deal. And then we have this brilliant comic timing from Macbeth. He's waited all this time while these conversations has been going on, thinking, right, when's the best time for me to reveal that I've actually killed the grooms, the king's guards as well? Oh yes, I do repent me of my fury that I did kill them. And Macduff said, come again? Say what? Wherefore did you so? Now I'm putting Macbeth on the psychiatrist's couch there, because the choice of timing isn't just intended to be amusing to Macbeth, because no one else is in on the joke. It also reveals what's going on inside his head. Look at his language. He doesn't say, I repent killing them. Instead, he distances himself from that. He uses the word yet, and he uses the word did. So instead of saying I kill, he distances himself with I did kill. And yet makes it appear a bit like an afterthought. If you read that line again, it sounds like Macbeth is describing something that happened a long time ago in the past. It's a bit like saying, oh yeah, I did used to watch Teletubbies when I was young. Yeah, I remember now. Yeah, that emphasis on did makes it seem like ages ago. Now, one of the things that I argue about Macbeth's personality is that the attraction of killing Duncan isn't so much that he gets to become king, because obviously he doesn't. The next in line is Malcolm. It's not logical for Macbeth to think he'll become king straight away. No, the real attraction is that he gets to keep killing, because he's suffering from bloodlust. You'll have to watch my other videos to see how I show that to you, but there is some obvious proof in this scene. Let's go back to that moment when Macbeth and Lennox and Ross entered. So they've all gone to see the dead king together. Presumably Macbeth has left the dead king's side a little earlier than Lennox and Ross, gone and found the two grooms and killed them, and then reappeared to stand around during this conversation having a little chuckle to himself while nobody notices that he's killed anybody. Now this proves that his killing has been exceptionally professional. He's managed to kill the grooms exceptionally quickly, and there isn't a spot of blood on him. If he came back covered in blood, everybody would stare at him and everyone would know what he'd done. So unlike the killing of Duncan, which he made sure was so bloody that he imagined he could never wash the bloods off his hands again, hence the reference to Neptune's oceans, here he's managed to kill them with no blood at all. And remember, I'm arguing that it's bloodlust that's driving him. It's not just killing, he wants slaughter. Well, that's why this murder that he's just committed is already in his own head in the past. It's because it's not satisfied him in any way. He's got no pleasure out of doing this, because there's been no bloodshed. Now there is another bit of grade 9 psychoanalysis going on here. Who is he actually talking to? I mean, obviously he's talking to everyone who's on stage. And then he goes into this long speech justifying why he's killed them. But the very first person to react to that is Lady Macbeth, who starts to faint. So one possibility is that he actually says this also to Lady Macbeth. Why? Well, she had this perfect plan. They would kill Duncan together. They were going to frame the grooms by planting the daggers on them with all the blood, so it looked like they did it. Lennox comes along, he sees the dead king, he sees the guards, and he says, yep, they're all covered in blood. It seemed they had done it. Looks like they did it. Guilty as tried. No man's life was to be trusted with them. So Lady Macbeth's plan is 100% foolproof, except Macbeth sets out to destroy it. Which brings us back to the original question, is Macbeth having a laugh? Because he's basically telling his wife, look, yeah, I screwed up your plan in the night when I didn't go back and take the daggers, and you had to step in and put the daggers on the groom. And now you thought that the plan was going really well, but no, I've screwed up the plan again. I've gone back and I've killed the grooms. I'm sorry. Ha 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 ha. That's the last time you get to wear the trousers in this relationship. I'll show you who's boss. So now we come to Lady Macbeth's reaction. Help me hence, ho! And look to the lady, says Macduff. As usual, there is more than one way to look at this. Let's look at the alliteration of the H. Help, hence, ho! These rhythmic H's make this sound like a performance, as though she's simply pretending to faint. This would certainly reinforce the idea that Macbeth is the dominant partner in the marriage, and she's trying to gain control of the situation once Macbeth, yet again, has ruined her plans. She is also cunningly playing into the note of chivalry at the time, the idea that women had to be helped by men and they were less powerful and simply weak. And so even though the king has just been killed, Macduff tells everybody to look after Lady Macbeth. Perhaps he even tries to catch her as she's fainting, to stop her injuring herself by hitting the floor. This, of course, is also a really cool alibi. It says, look, I'm a helpless female. I would never have anything to do with killing a king. What are you talking about? I'm innocent. Look at me. Weak and pathetic. Help me. Ho! But there is another possibility here, which is that Lady Macbeth actually genuinely does faint here. She can't believe what's happened and the danger to which Macbeth is now exposing them. He seems determined to make everybody believe that they were guilty and are covering up the truth coming out by killing the only witnesses, the grooms. So is Lady Macbeth having a laugh, deliberately exploiting this sense of chivalry and this patriarchal view that women are inferior, weak and emotionally unstable? Or actually has she been made emotionally unstable in this moment by Macbeth's actions? You decide. Now the next quotation introduces a bit of Shakespeare's purpose. Remember, we began the scene with Macduff's words, which made us think that Macduff thought that Duncan wasn't much of a king. Well, let's look at what his sons say. This is Donalbain, the younger son. Where we are, there's daggers in men's smiles. The near in blood, the nearer bloody. So this reference to the near in blood is a reference to blood relatives. What he's saying is the closest people are to us as a relative, the more likely they are to be bloody, in other words, to be the murderer. So Macbeth is their cousin. They obviously suspect him as a relative because they're thinking that as a relative he has more likelihood of claiming the throne. But hopefully you've been taught that is not how kings were chosen in Scotland in Macbeth's time. No, instead, kingship was not inherited. What would happen is that the king would look around for the best candidate and name the best candidate as his successor. Well, who is the best candidate? Is it Malcolm, this young son of Duncan, who seems to have achieved absolutely nothing? Or is it Macbeth, who almost single-handedly, I exaggerate for effect here, has saved the country from Norwegian invasion? You know, you can imagine all the lords and thanes standing around when Duncan is saying, yeah, I'm going to announce who my successor is, and they're all kind of looking towards Macbeth, and suddenly they have to shift their eyes away from him because Duncan has named his son. His son, for God's sake. How corrupt is that? Worthy candidate my foot. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Hopefully you know she died childless, so there was no heir. This meant that there would be competing descendants who would equally have a right to claim the throne. So here Shakespeare could be pointing out that simply picking a king through ancestry isn't a very good idea, because there are lots of ancestors who could claim the title. No, it's far better to pick a king who deserves it. You know, one way of reading the play is that none of this would have happened if Duncan hadn't named Malcolm as the successor. I mean, you could argue that he would want to kill Duncan even more because there would then be even more chance of Macbeth becoming king if he were already named as the successor, but equally you could argue that urgency wouldn't be there. He'd get the witches' prophecies and they'd say, you're going to become king, and he'd say, cool, I like the sound of that. What's the rush? So what do you think now you've gone through the scene with me? Was Macbeth having a laugh? Playing with the ideas as I have will give you the top grades. If you'd like to know more grade 9 ideas about Macbeth, click on the videos appearing now. See you soon on my channel.